On this episode of How to Make Dinner, I'm cooking with asparagus. Thanks so much for joining me today for another episode. It's peak spring right now and we finally have local asparagus. So I thought, what a great time to make some asparagus recipes and share them with you. So I've got 3 different kind of preparations to share with you today. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about asparagus itself and how to deal with it. When I bring asparagus home, I like to use it the same day. If you do need to keep it for more than a day or two, you can store it in a glass with some water, just like you're growing flowers. And it should stay fresh for 1 or 2 days. Another thing about asparagus is even when it's in season, it's not cheap. It's not really like something like zucchini where there's ever an issue to try and use it all up. And so whenever I buy it, I want to treat it really preciously. Whereas like with zucchini, it gets super cheap in the summer. I end up just burning through loads of zucchini. I make all kinds of crap with it. But asparagus, it's a special occasion kind of thing for me anyway. There's a lot of debate over how to trim asparagus, whether you should snap it or cut it. I am kind of the belief that you should snap it, but you have to be really careful about where you snap it because it'll snap anywhere. So if you give a bunch of asparagus to a kid and tell them to snap the ends off, for example, you're going to end up with a lot of really good asparagus going to waste. So if you are going to snap, the key is to start at the very, very bottom and like really try and see, that's not very much that I snapped off because I tried it at the very, very end and it didn't snap, and now it snaps. So that's only like an inch. Whereas if you're following the instructions to just snap your asparagus, you might just snap it like this and suddenly you're losing like 3 inches. So you need to kind of work your way up from the bottom and see, I got an extra inch out of that one. The reason I don't really go for cutting is because every asparagus is different. I find whenever I get locally grown asparagus especially, they're all very different. I've got some that barely have to snap anything off and then others that you need to snap quite a bit off. So I'm a snapper, but be careful, you know? See, like here, this was quite a bit. And you can always taste. Take a bite off of the snapped off bit. Yeah, see, that's tough. We don't want that. The thickness doesn't indicate a more tough kind of old asparagus. This one, for example, is really thin, but also very tough. And then with the scraps, this is one of those times where I definitely like to keep the scraps to make veggie stock. So I'll just collect them all, put them in a pot with onions and carrots and other scraps, and I'll make soup. I probably won't make asparagus soup because, like I said, asparagus is expensive and making soup out of it just feels a little bit like not really like getting the most out of it. So, but I'll probably make like a spring minestrone or a pea soup or something like that. And then there's the question of peeling, to peel or not to peel. For me, it depends. I like to peel about halfway up the stem when I'm using it for like a steamed preparation because I like it to be kind of extra refined, and I really love the texture when you can kind of cut through it with a fork and you don't get that like tough skin on the outside. But in other situations, I leave the peel on when I want it to be a bit more rustic. The first asparagus dish I wanted to show you is just a very simple steamed asparagus, and then I'm going to put some delicious things on top. So for the steamed asparagus, I do like to peel it. I like to peel about halfway up the stem. It makes them really, really tender and it makes them look really pretty as well. And then once they're peeled, I bring a tiny bit of water to a boil, and you can use a steamer for this. I don't have a steamer right now, so I'm just using a little bit of water in the bottom of a pan. And then I bring that to a rapid boil, drop the asparagus in and cook it for 4 minutes. I find 4 minutes to be the perfect length of time to make it just really tender, but still super bright green. And it still has that kind of like fresh crispness to it. And then if I'm not eating it right that second, I'll shock it under some cold water, just run cold water over it to stop it from cooking, or, you know, put it in an ice bath. or I'll just transfer it right to my plate and eat it. And then come the toppings. I mean, steamed asparagus is so good on its own with a few flakes of crunchy salt, a little bit of a drizzle of olive oil, maybe it's some grated Parmesan cheese, some cracked pepper, some chili flakes, you know, I could go on and on. But today I wanted something a little bit more hearty. So I poached an egg. Of course, I want it to be soft. That's my goal. And then I had some bacon lying around, so I just crisped up some bacon and sprinkled that over the top. And then because I wanted a little bit of extra salty crunchiness, I fried up some capers. If you've not done this before, it's super fun, and capers were on sale at Costco recently, so I bought a bunch of jars of capers. All you do is dry off the capers really well, heat up a few tablespoons of olive oil on about medium heat. Make sure that's really nice and hot before you drop the capers in. And then once the capers are dry, you can just drop them in gently. Be careful because there is a little bit of water inside the caper, so it's, you know, you want to kind of stand back. And then you just fry them for like 2, 3, 4 minutes, just until they kind of pop open, a little bit like popcorn, and then they get really, really crispy. So I just drain them on some paper towel and then sprinkle them on all kinds of stuff. I sprinkled them on top of this asparagus egg bacon thing, and it was so good. The second recipe I'm going to show you is a simple garlic sautéed asparagus. So here I just washed the asparagus, trimmed it, cut it into like 1 or 1.5 inch lengths because I just wanted to be able to eat it with a fork rather than cutting it after the fact. And then I sliced about 3 cloves of garlic. Then I just heated up a nonstick pan. You can use any pan, you can use a cast iron, you can use a stainless steel. This is just what I had. And I poured a little bit of the oil that I had left from the caper frying escapade. You could use butter, you could use olive oil. And then I just dropped the garlic in, and I dropped the asparagus in pretty much at the exact same time. I don't want the garlic to be in there too long on its own, otherwise it'll start to burn. And I find that when you add it at the same time as the asparagus, the garlic just gets perfectly golden and it doesn't burn. So then I just toss the asparagus and garlic around, sprinkle a bit of salt, and let it cook for about 4 to 5 minutes that way. Then comes the extra special part, the topping. So because I wanted a little bit of crunch, I took some toasted breadcrumbs that I had. I actually had some toasty kind of croutons, and I ended up smushing them into breadcrumbs in my mortar and pestle. And then I added in the zest of a lemon and probably about a tablespoon of grated Parmesan cheese. Tossed that together, and then that became my little topping for my garlic sautéed asparagus. So, so good. And for my last trick, I'm gonna do a little bit of a raw asparagus thing, which I love. My grandma Phyllis always grew asparagus in her garden, and I have memories of going out there with her and eating asparagus just straight out of the garden. She would just hand me one, and it was so good, and I love the flavor of it raw. And it's kind of unusual to see it raw, but it's so, so nice. So here I've just got some nice asparagus. I've already trimmed it, and I'm just going to slice it thinly on a diagonal. Depending how much patience you have, these will be thinner or thicker. And if you go one at a time, you can get a really nice angled cut. I'm going to be a bit rushed here. And it's so delicious. It's so good raw. And I do kind of like to leave the heads somewhat intact. I might cut them in half. And then I'm going to add some tomatoes. So this is a little bit unusual because usually tomatoes and asparagus aren't ripe at the same time. Tomatoes are more of a late summer thing. But we have a greenhouse here, and they grow the best tomatoes, and they're already ready. So I have some cherry tomatoes here that I bought locally, and they're pretty darn delicious. And I'm stoked about it because tomato season is the best season. And I'm just gonna cut these in half. And then I have one of these basil plants that you can buy in the grocery store. They're kind of not the best. Like, they're not gonna grow like a normal basil plant will outside, but I don't know if they do something to these to make it so that they don't really grow that well, but it does give you a lot of basil for the first few days until you pick it all. So, and sometimes they're a pretty good deal. I got this one for $4.99. So I'm down with that. I love fresh basil. I think I'm just excited for summer, so I'm jumping on whatever summer produce bandwagon I can here. And you can chop this or tear it. I'm just gonna tear it in. And then all I'm really gonna do from there is add a good amount of salt, a pretty good splash of olive oil, and I'm gonna squeeze a half a lemon. And as this sits a little bit, the asparagus will kind of tenderize a little bit from the lemon and the olive oil and the salt. I'm just gonna toss it together. This is so simple, but I love the crunch, the fresh asparagus crunch. So good. And then the last thing I'm gonna add to this is actually just a big handful of crumbled feta. We call this feta, but I actually found out a while ago that it's technically not, because feta is kind of like champagne. Like, if it's not from Greece and made in this particular way, it's not actually called feta. But there are tons of white brined cheeses all around the whole Mediterranean and Balkan kind of regions. So this one is a Macedonian cheese. It says Macedonian feta, and we often use Bulgarian cheese, which is, you know, we call it Bulgarian feta, but it's technically not feta, but just to say. And I think that's it. That's my salad. This is just a very simple way to kind of celebrate asparagus and get excited for summer. That was a good one. So good. That's it for my asparagus extravaganza. I hope you liked this episode. I hope that I gave you some good ideas for what to do with that precious asparagus when you get your hands on it. And I hope you like these recipes. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you next week.